Hi, everybody. So, even though I've gotten a little burnt out talking about atheism and Christianity and stuff like that all the time, and that's why I've started these new channels to talk about different things, those topics haven't totally left my mind. So, occasionally I'll think about something or hear about something and get the itch to talk about it. So, that's where we're at today. In this case, it is the Christian claim that the secular world, specifically the secular West, borrows or steals all its important moral principles from Christianity. And so, to whatever extent the modern world or the Western world is a good place, it's because of Christianity. Now, this idea is pretty stupid on its face, but it can be kind of hard to disprove. Because whenever Christian principles and, secular principles coincide, Christians can just claim cause and effect. They might also kind of broadly allude to how horrible things were back in the ancient world. The Romans were like this. Ancient people were just horrible to each other. And then kind of claim that things got better when Christianity came around, while ignoring, minimizing, or no true Christianing the horrors of the Christian world that followed, of course. So how can we address this? How can we really pin them down on such a slippery, semantic-laden claim? Now, I'm sure there are different ways to go about it, and I'm sure you're all dutifully typing yours away in the comments right now, but I see one simple, straightforward way to just show how completely nonsensical it is. And to set the stage, we first have to be clear about a couple of things. Just be really explicit about the obvious, because that's what you have to do with apologetics sometimes. First, what is a moral principle? I would say that this can be defined as any expectation we have for human behavior. We somehow decide that certain behaviors are right or wrong, and we expect people to abstain from or adopt those behaviors. For example, murder is wrong, so we expect people not to murder. Non-consensual sexual acts are wrong, so we expect people not to commit them. Abusing children is wrong, so don't do that and nurture them instead. Helping others is right, so we expect people to do that in some capacity. Most principles like this are codified to some extent, and even if they weren't, basically everybody, with very few exceptions, agrees with them. And they agree to the point of having a deep primal revulsion for the horrible acts in the first column, and thus agree with the principles in the second. I mean, sure, there are sociopaths and cultural outliers, but unless you're looking to nitpick, you know what I'm talking about. Now, I guess I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole talking about agreement when I was supposed to be explaining what moral principles are, but that actually works with my point, because one of the defining things about these principles is basically how much we all agree on them, or at least to the ones people are appealing to when they gesture broadly toward our core moral values. And this includes Christians, because what do you think they're trying to take credit for when they say their religion gave us our morality? Do you think they want to put it on one side or the other of difficult moral dilemmas that don't have clear answers? Or saddle it with traditional Christian stances on whether people should be allowed to be gay or women should live under the headship of their husbands? No. They want to say it's responsible for the obvious stuff we all feel strongly about, don't murder, don't be cruel, stuff like that, because that's what has all the obvious universal appeal. So second, what does it mean for a moral principle to have secular value? To put it simply, it means that these principles encourage behavior that generally make life better for people, make society a safer, more comfortable place to live. And we use the word secular to describe this because the outcomes it produces are demonstrable, independent of any kind of supernatural question or question of God's existence. Basically, everybody agrees that rules like these prohibiting killing and brazen cruelty help achieve that goal. And that's what we mean when they say they have secular value. Of course, from there we can progress the conversation on to more complicated dilemmas and value judgments. But through it all, this core goal of improving well-being is what we're going after. On the other hand, what it means for a moral principle to have religious value is fairly straightforward. It means that the principle aligns with dictates codified by a religion. Now, those dictates could be said to come from a god, a book of scripture, whatever else. But at its core, the fact that this dictate exists is reason in and of itself to follow it without question. Now, people might argue this without question thing, but start questioning the core dictates of the religion and see what happens, The thing is, it's all about rules and you don't dig any further than that. So basically, we have two different ways to conceive of what a moral principle is. Now, of course, secular and religious principles can be different or they can overlap. But when Christians claim their religion is responsible for principles with demonstrable secular value, they're introducing the question of why they overlap. And they're proposing an answer, which is that they overlap because Christianity, specifically teachings unique to that religion, taught people to do things that we now recognize have positive secular outcomes. This puts them in a position that looks good for pretty obvious reasons. I mean, it credits them for all the good things in society, and who wouldn't want that? But it's actually a pretty tenuous position once you think about it. It's hard to justify for one, and then it also has the potential to make Christianity look kind of dumb, so it kind of backfires. The hard to justify part is that this is seriously suggesting that people would have never figured this out on their own without Christianity. It would have never occurred to them that people running around murdering and stealing and hurting each other would degenerate into a bad situation, and that maybe rules prohibiting these behaviors, would be a good solution. And this is where the benefit of this position backfires. It credits Christianity with producing teachings that are just so obvious that they have universal appeal. In other words, not murdering is beneficial to society. Christianity says not to murder. Therefore, Christianity teaches something that is beneficial to society. That's the implicit argument from consequence that's being made here. But if people recognize that not murdering is beneficial to society, and thus it was a good idea that Christianity came up with it, wouldn't they be equally likely to just put two and two together and decide to prohibit murder anyway? It seems like they would, unless you think the societies wouldn't want to do something that benefits themselves unless a religion told them to, which, now that I think about it, is kind of exactly what apologists say.
Duh, what's their objective basis for valuing well-being? Duh.
But that doesn't mean the rest of us have to take it seriously. If a text says something just incredibly obvious, like we shouldn't murder people or rubbing two sticks together makes a fire, that probably just means that a person noticed the same thing that everybody else noticed and decided to write it down. Probably didn't have anything to do with a god. The make it look dumb part arises from the fact that when you say Christianity is good because of something, in this case because of teachings that lead to demonstrably positive secular outcomes, you leave yourself open to the questions of, well, what about the teachings that don't? I mean, sure, don't murder is a pretty sensible teaching, but what about don't be gay? Wives should submit to their husbands. Get circumcised. Build a tabernacle according to these specifications and slaughter animals in front of it. Believe something on faith or else go to hell. Those rules, and the countless others like them, are either appalling or don't make sense. So is the fact that super important teachings like don't engage in non-consensual sexual activity are either ignored or muddied. So is the fact that the Bible remains in the realm of the blindingly obvious and never addresses the nuance of complex moral dilemmas on any intelligent level whatsoever. So is the fact that the same Christianity that's supposedly responsible for all our wonderful Western values took centuries to get fucking slavery right. And therein lies the danger. Once you've suggested that Christian teaching is to be judged based on how sensible it is, even if you conclude that it is sensible, you've opened a Pandora's box that can be really hard to get back closed, especially if people start thinking about it more than you'd hoped. And that's the thing. Christians don't want you thinking about this too long. Or at least Christian leaders and Christian apologists. They want you to look at do not murder, but they don't want you to look at from them you may buy slaves. And if you do look at from them you may buy slaves, or wives should submit to their husbands, or slay all the Amalekites, or stone disobedient children, and on and on and on, they'll bend over backward trying to come up with a justification. And what must this justification do? Ensure that Christian teaching aligns with, or at least isn't offensive to, our secular understanding of the consequences of our actions. And so to explain why the secular world doesn't borrow from Christianity, and in fact why Christianity adapts to and borrows from the secular world, you just need to ask two questions. One, do Christians care whether their teachings align with basic secular moral principles? I think we've pretty much already belabored the fact that they obviously do. If you as much as just quote a Bible verse about slavery to a Christian, they're going to recognize that it at least seems to offend humanist values and try to come up with an excuse for why it doesn't. There's this tension there that they feel needs to be resolved. So then to the second question, do I care whether my secular moral principles align with Christianity? In other words, what if a Christian tries to do the reverse back to me? What if they point out a way in which my secular humanist values don't align with a Bible, or with some other kind of traditional Christian teachings? That's not going to faze me in the least, because I just don't care what the Bible or Christianity says. And this pretty much tells us everything we need to know about this question, right? If I were borrowing my values from Christianity, I would be comfortable borrowing all of them, or maybe have a compulsion to borrow all of them equally, regardless of what they said. I would borrow a man shall not lie with a man as with a woman as readily as I'd borrow you shall not kill. And unlike a Christian who might have some compulsion to explain why, a man shall not lie with a man as with a woman has some kind of demonstrable secular value, I would have no concern whatsoever for reconciling the difference. The teachings and values of Christianity are a non-factor to me. I'm comfortable when my values align with Christianity, and I'm comfortable when my values clash with Christianity. I don't see Christians sharing the same level of comfort. At least not all of them, at least not all the time. It takes very little to trigger discomfort in them when you point out or when they recognize that some aspect of Christian teaching is either cruel or inhumane or in some other way doesn't align with secular values. And I think that's because when you're borrowing from a value system, you care how well you align with that value system. So by looking at who's bothered when Christian and secular values clash, I think we can pretty clearly see who's borrowing from whom.